Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling episode of Dark Realms with me, Mr. Dark, your guide into the shadows, where fear and fascination collide. Tonight, I bring you a tale that will linger in your mind long after the lights go out. This story isn't just about a village plagued by dark forces. It's about courage, sacrifice, and the unrelenting battle between light and darkness. What would you do if your home was under siege, not by men, but by vengeful spirits, summoned by a man who traded his humanity for power? In this episode, we travel to the mysterious Blackwood village, where the living and the dead fought side by side against an evil that even death could not contain. Turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself, for this is not just a story. It's a journey into the unknown. I am Mr. Dark, and this is the tale of the guardian of Blackwood Village. It was a chilly September evening when we all gathered in our dorm room at University College London. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as we huddled around a dimly lit lamp, sharing ghost stories to pass the time. In our group, there was one person who never seemed interested in such tales, Matthew Dyer, a stoic and rational thinker. But that year, something was different. "Matthew," I asked, breaking his usual silence, "why do you always leave every September to visit your home village? You've never told us what's so special about this time of year." Matthew shifted uneasily in his chair. He glanced at the others and then finally spoke, his voice measured but laced with an uncharacteristic seriousness. "It's not a vacation," he said, his tone growing softer. "Every September, my village holds a ritual to honor someone who isn't exactly alive anymore." The room fell silent. Even the usual skeptics among us leaned in, curious. "Not alive? What do you mean?" Sarah, our self-proclaimed atheist, asked with a smirk. Matthew exhaled deeply before replying, "It's a long story, but every year we honor Father Blackwood, the man who saved our village. He's been dead for over 50 years, yet he's still around." The air grew heavy with intrigue. None of us dared to laugh. It wasn't just what Matthew said, it was the way he said it, his eyes darting to the shadows as though he expected to see someone lurking there. "All right," I said. "Start from the beginning. Who was Father Blackwood, and why does your village still worship him?" Matthew hesitated, then nodded, as if deciding it was finally time to reveal the truth. Blackwood Village is a tiny settlement surrounded by dense woods. It's old, older than most places you'd find on the map. Father Blackwood, whose real name was Thomas Blackwood, was a healer, a farmer, and a sort of protector for the people there. Everyone loved him. He wasn't a priest, despite the father title. It was a nickname people gave him out of respect. He owned a large orchard and shared his apples with everyone, especially the children. He performed blessings, healed the sick with his herbal remedies, and never asked for much in return. To the villagers, he was a saint in every sense of the word. Matthew paused, his voice tinged with sorrow as he continued. But one stormy evening, everything changed. Father Blackwood was inspecting his orchard when lightning struck, killing him instantly. The villagers found his body beneath the twisted branches of an old apple tree. His death left a gaping hole in our community. The funeral was a grand affair. Villagers from miles around came to pay their respects, filling the small churchyard to capacity. Father Blackwood was buried at the edge of the orchard he loved so much. For days, a pall of grief hung over the village. But, Matthew continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, it didn't end there. A few weeks after his burial, strange things started happening. "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward. "Well," Matthew said, "the first to notice was an old baker named Jacob. One evening, as he was walking home with a basket of bread, he swore he heard Father Blackwood's voice calling his name. 'Jacob,' the voice had said, clear as day. Jacob turned around. expecting to see someone, but the path was empty. Thinking he was just tired, he continued walking. But then he heard it again, louder this time. "Jacob, share your bread with me." Jacob froze, his hands trembling. He recognized the voice. It was Father Blackwood's, unmistakable. In a panic, he hurried home and slammed the door shut. He told his wife, who dismissed it as grief playing tricks on his mind. "But," Matthew said, his tone growing darker, "that wasn't the end of it." Over the following weeks, more villagers reported similar encounters. They'd hear Father Blackwood's voice or catch fleeting glimpses of him in his orchard. At first, they were terrified, thinking it was a curse. But then something strange happened. People started noticing that these encounters weren't harmful at all. If anything, Father Blackwood seemed to be helping them. "Helping them?" Sarah interjected, her skepticism faltering. Matthew nodded. One night, a group of bandits tried to raid the village. They were armed and ready to steal livestock and grain. But before they could reach the first house, they claimed they saw a figure, tall, glowing faintly, and blocking their path. The figure didn't speak, just stood there, radiating an unnatural presence. The bandits panicked and fled, leaving the village untouched. The room fell silent. None of us dared to laugh anymore. Matthew leaned back in his chair, looking drained. "And that's why," he said quietly, "every year we honor Father Blackwood. He protected us in life, and he still protects us in death. But there's more to the story, something darker. That's what the ritual is really about." "What do you mean, darker?" I asked. Matthew's gaze lingered on the flickering candlelight, and he whispered, "It's not just Father Blackwood's spirit in the village. Something else came for us, something that even he had to fight to keep at bay. But that's a story for another night." The train to Blackwood village rumbled through the quiet countryside. Matthew sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the rolling hills, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. The rest of us, Sarah, James and I, sat silently, still trying to process the chilling story he had told us the night before. As we approached the village, the scenery shifted. The green hills darkened into dense, shadowy woods, their towering trees casting long, eerie shadows over the dirt roads and thatched roofs of the small settlement. Matthew pointed to a weathered stone marker at the edge of the village. "That's where it all started," he said grimly. In the late 19th century, Blackwood village was a haven of simplicity and unity. The villagers trusted one another and shared their harvests during lean years. But that harmony was shattered with the arrival of Sir Edmund Harcourt. A wealthy and ruthless landowner, Sir Edmund had purchased a vast estate on the outskirts of the village. His mansion loomed on a hill, its dark windows and spired roof visible from nearly every corner of Blackwood. From the moment he arrived, Sir Edmund ruled with an iron fist, demanding exorbitant rents and crushing anyone who opposed him. Things came to a head when his only daughter, Clara, fell in love with a young farmer named William. Their romance was the stuff of village gossip, but to Sir Edmund it was a humiliation. When he discovered their plans to marry, he flew into a rage and locked Clara in her room. "She belongs to her station," he had roared, "not to some dirt-covered peasant." But Clara and William were determined. One stormy night, they fled the village, leaving Sir Edmund seething with rage. His reputation was ruined, and he blamed the villagers for harboring the couple and helping them escape. "They will pay for their insolence," he had muttered, and he meant it. Blinded by fury, Sir Edmund sought out an infamous necromancer who lived in the shadows of the moors, a man known only as Balthazar. The villagers had whispered of Balthazar for years, calling him the Shadow Weaver for his ability to summon spirits and bind them to his will. When Sir Edmund arrived at Balthazar's crumbling tower, he offered the necromancer a fortune. "I want Blackwood to suffer," he demanded. "Let the spirits of the damned haunt them until their last breath." Balthazar, whose greed rivaled his dark powers, agreed. But he warned Sir Edmund, summoning such forces comes at a price. The spirits I call will not be easy to control. They will feed on fear, on chaos, and on life itself. I don't care. Sir Edmund spat. Do it. For 7 days and nights, Balthazar performed his ritual. He called upon the spirits of the tormented dead, those who had died in agony, betrayal, and rage. The air around his tower grew heavy with the smell of sulphur, and the skies above the village darkened unnaturally, even during the day. When the ritual was complete, a horde of spirits emerged, their forms pale and twisted, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Balthazar had bound them with his spells, giving them one command: torment Blackwood village. At first, the villagers noticed small, unsettling things. Doors would creak open on their own, even when bolted shut. Livestock refused to graze near the woods, their eyes wide with terror. Children woke up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming they had seen figures standing at the foot of their beds. But soon the hauntings grew bolder. One evening, a farmer named Peter was walking home from the fields when he heard someone call his name. Peter. The voice was faint but unmistakable, coming from the edge of the woods. "Who's there?" Peter called, his voice shaking. There was no answer, only the rustling of leaves. Then a figure emerged, a woman with pale, sunken eyes and a gaping mouth. Her skin was translucent, her limbs distorted as though she had been broken and pieced back together. Peter turned to run, but the spirit moved with impossible speed, blocking his path. Before he could scream, she lunged at him, her icy fingers gripping his face. The next morning, Peter was found wandering the village square, his eyes blank and his body trembling. When the villagers approached him, he collapsed, muttering, "They're here. They've come for us." By the end of the week, the hauntings had spread throughout the village. People reported seeing ghostly figures in their homes, hearing whispers in the dead of night, and feeling invisible hands tugging at their clothes. Desperate, the villagers gathered in the church praying for deliverance. That's when Father Blackwood appeared. He materialized in the center of the room, his spectral form glowing faintly in the candlelight. Gasps echoed through the church, but his calm, reassuring presence steadied them. "I am here to protect you," he said, his voice firm but kind. "But this evil is unlike anything I've faced before. You must listen carefully if we are to survive." He explained the source of the hauntings, the spirits summoned by Balthazar, and warned the villagers to stay indoors after sunset and never open their doors to anyone, no matter what they heard outside. "But what about you, Father?" one villager asked. Father Blackwood smiled faintly. "I am already dead. They cannot harm me as they would harm you." Despite Father Blackwood's warnings, the spirits found ways to sow chaos. They began to possess the villagers, taking over their bodies and turning them into hollow-eyed puppets. One evening, a young woman named Eleanor returned home after visiting a neighbor. She seemed fine at first, but as the night wore on, her husband noticed her strange behavior. She stared at the wall for hours, muttering in a language he didn't recognize. When he tried to touch her, she turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Leave me," she hissed, her voice distorted and unrecognizable. The next morning, Eleanor was gone. Her husband found her wandering the woods, her dress torn and her feet bleeding, as though she had walked for miles. When he called out to her, she turned and whispered, "They're coming for us all." By the time the sun set on the 7th day, half the village was under the spirit's control. Those who were still free barricaded themselves in their homes, clutching crucifixes and muttering prayers. The air was thick with dread, and every shadow seemed to hold a pair of glowing eyes. Father Blackwood stood at the edge of the village, his spectral form shimmering against the gathering darkness. "I can hold them off for now," he murmured, "but Balthazar will not stop. His power grows with every soul these spirits consume." He turned toward the church, his expression grave. "We will need more than prayers to survive this." Night descended on Blackwood village like a thick, suffocating blanket. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it the eerie sound of distant whispers. Inside their homes, the villagers huddled together, clutching whatever talismans or relics they believed might protect them. At the edge of the village, Father Blackwood stood like a lone sentinel, his ghostly form shimmering faintly in the moonlight. He could sense them, spirits creeping closer, their hunger for chaos growing. He tightened his grip on the spectral staff that materialized in his hands, its golden light glowing brighter as the darkness closed in. It began with a whisper. Faint and indistinct, it wove through the village like a sinister thread, pulling at the edges of sanity. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing off the cobblestones of the empty streets. Father Blackwood's gaze shifted toward the woods. Emerging from the shadows were dozens of spirits, their forms grotesque and misshapen. Some looked almost human, while others were horrors beyond comprehension. Twisted limbs, eyeless faces, and gaping mouths filled with darkness. Behind them, the possessed villagers followed, their faces blank and their movements unnatural. "You have no place here," Father Blackwood said, his voice ringing with authority. "Leave this village, or I will send you back to the void where you belong." The spirits paused, their glowing eyes fixed on him. One stepped forward, a woman with a skeletal frame and a head that seemed to hang at an unnatural angle. When she spoke, her voice was a chilling mixture of many voices, layered atop one another. "You cannot stop us, old man," she hissed. "We are legion, we are hunger, and this village belongs to us now." With a sharp cry, the spirits charged. They moved like a shadowy tide, spreading out to surround Father Blackwood. He raised his staff, its light bursting forth in a radiant beam that cut through the first wave of spirits, sending them wailing into the night. But more came. The possessed villagers lunged at him, their bodies jerking like marionettes on invisible strings. Father Blackwood swung his staff, its golden energy forming an arc that knocked them back. Yet for every villager he subdued, another took their place. "Stay down!" he commanded, but his voice barely carried over the cacophony of shrieks and howls. The spirits began to spread through the village, their forms slipping through cracks in doors and windows. Inside their homes, the villagers screamed as the spirits tried to pull them into the shadows. At the church, Reverend Thomas, a devout but aging man, stood with a small group of villagers who had sought refuge. Hearing the commotion outside, he hesitated, clutching the heavy oak door. "Father Blackwood told us to stay inside," a woman pleaded. "But he's out there alone," Reverend Thomas replied, his face pale. "I cannot abandon him." He turned to the villagers. "Pray, pray with all your might." With that, he opened the door and stepped outside, clutching a heavy silver crucifix. At the center of the village, Father Blackwood continued to fight. He hurled bolts of light at the spirits, their wails tearing through the night as they disintegrated under his power. But for every spirit he vanquished, 3 more seemed to rise in its place. One spirit, a towering figure with antlers sprouting from its head, struck him with a blast of dark energy. Father Blackwood staggered, his form flickering as though the attack had weakened him. The skeletal woman reappeared, circling him like a predator. "You are strong," she said mockingly, "but you are alone. Even the strongest fall when they stand alone." Father Blackwood's eyes burned with defiance. "I am not alone," he said. At that moment, Reverend Thomas stepped into the square, holding the crucifix high. "In the name of the Lord," he shouted, "I command you to leave this place." The spirits hissed and recoiled as the crucifix began to glow, but their retreat was short-lived. One of them lunged at Reverend Thomas, knocking the crucifix from his hands. He cried out as the spirits swarmed him, their shadowy tendrils dragging him to the ground. "Reverend!" Father Blackwood called, rushing to his aid. He thrust his staff forward, releasing a burst of light that scattered the spirits, but the damage had been done. Reverend Thomas lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. The villagers inside the church heard the commotion and, emboldened by Reverend Thomas's bravery, began to emerge. Armed with whatever they could find, candles, iron tools, and even kitchen knives, they rallied around Father Blackwood. "We can't let him fight alone," Jameson the blacksmith shouted as he swung a hammer at a nearby spirit. The skeletal woman laughed, her voice ringing across the square. "You think these pathetic mortals can save you?" The villagers' fear was palpable, but Father Blackwood's presence gave them courage. "Together," he said, his voice steady, "we fight together." The spirits surged forward again, and the battle resumed. The villagers fought valiantly, their improvised weapons proving surprisingly effective against the ethereal forms. Meanwhile, Father Blackwood concentrated on the possessed, his staff glowing brighter with each villager he freed from the spirit's control. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the spirits began to weaken. The light seemed to sap their strength, their forms growing fainter. Realizing this, Father Blackwood raised his staff high, channeling the sunlight into a final blinding burst of energy. The spirits screamed as the light consumed them, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The square fell silent. The villagers, battered and exhausted, stared in awe at Father Blackwood, whose ghostly form flickered like a candle in the wind. "This is not over," he said gravely. "Balthazar will not stop. He grows stronger with every soul he claims. We must prepare for what's to come." As the villagers tended to their wounded and reinforced their defenses, Father Blackwood remained at the edge of the square, his eyes fixed on the woods. "Balthazar will come," he whispered to himself, "and when he does, I will be ready." The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Blackwood village stood on edge in the days following the first battle. The skies seemed perpetually grey, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. The villagers worked tirelessly, fortifying their homes and sharpening tools, while Father Blackwood patrolled the village, his spectral form flickering like a lone lantern in the darkness. Despite their efforts, an unshakable sense of dread settled over the village. Balthazar, the necromancer, had not yet made his move, but they all knew he would. Late one evening, a cold wind swept through the village, carrying with it a foul stench of decay. Animals cowered in their pens, and the villagers instinctively withdrew to their homes. In the silence that followed, a rhythmic tapping echoed through the woods, a deliberate and sinister sound. Balthazar had arrived. Clad in a black cloak that seemed to absorb all light, the necromancer stepped into the village square. His face was gaunt, his eyes a sickly yellow that glowed faintly in the dim light. He carried a twisted staff carved with ancient runes, its tip crackling with malevolent energy. Behind him floated a horde of spirits, those he had summoned and enslaved, now strengthened by the chaos they had wrought. The village seemed to shrink under his presence, the very air quivering with his power. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice as cold and sharp as a blade. "Your defiance amuses me, but it ends tonight. Surrender, or I will burn this wretched place to the ground." Inside the church, the villagers huddled together, listening to Balthazar's voice echo through the village. Some trembled with fear, while others clutched their makeshift weapons, their faces set with grim determination. "We won't let him take our home," Jameson the blacksmith said, his hammer resting on his lap. "But how can we stop him?" a woman asked, her voice quivering. "He commands those." Things. And Father Blackwood, he's only one ghost. Father Blackwood, standing near the church door, turned to face them. "You are not powerless," he said. "Your unity, your courage, that is what weakens his grip. Together, we can hold him at bay." "But for how long?" Reverend Thomas asked, his face pale but resolute. "As long as it takes," Father Blackwood replied. Balthazar raised his staff and with a guttural incantation unleashed a torrent of black energy. It surged through the village, smashing into homes and shattering windows. The spirits, emboldened by their master's power, descended upon the village like a swarm of locusts. Father Blackwood emerged from the church, his golden staff glowing brightly. He struck the ground, sending a wave of light outward that slowed the spirits' advance. "Balthazar!" he shouted, his voice ringing through the chaos. "This ends now!" The necromancer turned, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Ah, the ghostly guardian," he sneered. "You've been a thorn in my side long enough. Let's see how strong you truly are." Balthazar raised his staff, summoning a swirling vortex of dark energy that lashed out at Father Blackwood. The spectral guardian countered with a beam of golden light, the two forces colliding in a brilliant explosion that lit up the square. The villagers watched in awe and terror as the battle unfolded. Father Blackwood's light was strong, but Balthazar's power was relentless, his dark magic fueled by years of hatred and the energy of the spirits he controlled. "Stay back!" Father Blackwood commanded the villagers as he fought to hold the necromancer's power at bay. But Balthazar wasn't content to focus solely on Father Blackwood. He turned his attention to the villagers, sending his spirits to infiltrate the church. The doors shook violently as the spirits battered them, and the villagers inside braced themselves for the inevitable breach. Jameson, the blacksmith, led a small group of villagers outside, their faces hardened with resolve. Armed with iron tools, they struck at the spirits, their blows surprisingly effective. Each strike disrupted the spirits' forms, forcing them to retreat momentarily. "Use the iron!" Jameson shouted. "It weakens them!" The villagers rallied, fighting back with whatever weapons they could find. Meanwhile, Reverend Thomas and a group of women and children remained in the church, praying fervently. The battle between Father Blackwood and Balthazar reached its peak. Both combatants were visibly weakened, their powers waning. Father Blackwood's spectral form flickered dangerously, while Balthazar's staff began to crack under the strain of their duel. "You cannot defeat me!" Balthazar roared. "You are bound to this village, and I am free to destroy it." Father Blackwood's expression was calm, even as his light dimmed. "You're wrong," he said. "My strength comes not from this village, but from the people I protect." With that, he channeled every ounce of his energy into a final attack. His staff glowed brighter than ever before, releasing a blinding wave of light that engulfed the square. The spirits screamed as they were torn apart, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The necromancer stumbled, his staff shattering in his hands. He stared in disbelief as Father Blackwood advanced, his light burning with righteous fury. "No!" Balthazar screamed, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to defend himself. Father Blackwood struck the ground with his staff one last time, sending a golden shockwave through the village. The necromancer was thrown backward, his body consumed by the light. When the glow faded, Balthazar was gone. Father Blackwood's form began to flicker, his energy spent. He turned to the villagers who stood silently, their faces etched with both relief and sorrow. "The spirits are gone," he said, his voice faint. "But so am I. My time here is over." The villagers cried out in protest, but Father Blackwood raised a hand to silence them. "Do not mourn me," he said. "I have found peace. Protect each other as I have protected you." With those final words, his form dissolved into the morning light. leaving behind only the faint glow of his staff, which lay in the center of the square. The first light of dawn broke over Blackwood village, casting long shadows over the battle-worn square. The once vibrant village now felt like a ghost town, its streets littered with debris and scorch marks from the clash between Father Blackwood and the necromancer Balthazar. The villagers, bruised and weary, gathered near the center of the square where Father Blackwood had vanished. His spectral staff lay on the cobblestones, its faint golden glow flickering like a dying ember. Jameson, the blacksmith, knelt beside it and hesitated before picking it up. "He's really gone," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. As the sun rose higher, the villagers began to assess the damage. Several homes had been partially destroyed, their walls crumbling from the necromancer's dark magic. Livestock were scattered, many too terrified to be coaxed back into their pens. The villagers who had been possessed were still unconscious, their bodies weak but alive. Reverend Thomas moved from one to the next, offering prayers and checking for injuries. "We survived," he said quietly, though his face betrayed little relief. "But at what cost?" Sarah, one of the younger women, looked toward the edge of the square where the woods began. "Do you think Balthazar is really gone?" she asked. Jameson, still holding Father Blackwood's staff, shook his head. "If he isn't," he said grimly, "we'll be ready for him." Miles away, deep in the shadowy woods, Balthazar's lifeless body lay slumped against the roots of a gnarled tree. His shattered staff lay beside him, its once malevolent energy extinguished. For all his power, the necromancer had been undone by his own arrogance. The spirits he had enslaved were gone, and his connection to the dark forces severed. He was nothing more than a man now, frail and broken. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy above, Balthazar's body began to wither, turning to ash that scattered on the wind. In the days that followed, the villagers worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes and lives. Though they were grateful to be free of Balthazar's curse, a somberness hung over the village. The loss of Father Blackwood was a wound that no amount of time or effort could heal. Reverend Thomas called for a gathering in the church to honor their fallen protector. The entire village turned out, their faces lit by the glow of hundreds of candles. At the center of the altar stood Father Blackwood's staff, its faint golden light a reminder of his enduring spirit. Jameson stepped forward, his voice strong despite the emotion that choked it. "Father Blackwood gave everything to protect us," he said. "He fought for this village in life and in death, and though he's gone, his legacy lives on in us." The villagers bowed their heads in silence, their prayers carrying an unspoken promise to uphold the unity and courage that Father Blackwood had inspired in them. The village square, once a place of fear and conflict, became a symbol of hope. The staff was embedded in a stone pedestal at its center, a permanent monument to Father Blackwood's sacrifice. Children, once too frightened to play outside after sunset, now ran freely under the watchful eye of the staff. The villagers believed its glow was a sign that Father Blackwood still watched over them, protecting them from harm. And while life slowly returned to normal, the villagers never forgot the night their peaceful home became a battleground between light and darkness. One quiet evening, weeks after the battle, Reverend Thomas stood alone in the square, gazing at the glowing staff. The night was calm, the air still, yet he felt a familiar presence beside him. "Father Blackwood," he whispered. The faint outline of the spectral guardian appeared, his face serene. "You've done well," Father Blackwood said, his voice soft. "The village is safe. That's all I ever wanted." Reverend Thomas's eyes welled with tears. "You'll always be a part of this village," he said. "We'll never forget you." Father Blackwood smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said, "but it's time for me to rest now." As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Father Blackwood's form began to fade. The last thing Reverend Thomas saw was his smile, warm and peaceful. And then he was gone. Years passed, and Blackwood village flourished. The tale of Father Blackwood and his battle against the necromancer became legend, told around hearths and passed down through generations. Visitors to the village often remarked on the golden glow of the staff in the square, marveling at its beauty, but never fully understanding its significance. For the villagers, it was more than a relic. It was a symbol of their protector, a constant reminder that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. And though Father Blackwood was gone, his spirit lingered in their hearts, as strong and steadfast as the roots of the village itself.